The pit is silent now, save for the soft, wet rasp of scales moving against damp earth. A sound so faint it might just be the wind shifting the fallen leaves on the forest floor above. We are standing at the edge of a hollow in the ground in Northumbria, looking down into a darkness that smells of overturned soil, rain-soaked iron, and the metallic tang of old blood that has long since cooled. The cheering has stopped. The jeering crowds that lined the rim just hours ago have dispersed, returning to their thatched cottages and warm hearths, leaving the king's justice to rot in the cold English night. It is a scene of absolute stillness, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a held breath that the world is afraid to release. The torches have been extinguished, their smoke drifting up into a sky the color of a bruised plum. And the only witness left is the moon, pale and indifferent, watching the inevitable consequences of a king's hubris take root in the dark. This is not the moment of the kill. This is the moment after, when the adrenaline fades and the reality of what has been done begins to settle like frost on the grass. Close your eyes and let the image form behind your eyelids. The damp chill of the air touching your skin, the scent of wet stone and decaying autumn leaves, and the overwhelming silence of a world that has just made a terrible mistake. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us step back from the edge and walk through the mist toward the stone keep where King Ahela sits, perhaps swirling a goblet of wine, believing he has secured his legacy by destroying a legend. He does not know yet that he has not ended a threat, but rather uncorked a vessel of wrath that will drown his kingdom. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok is a story often told with the roar of battle, but tonight we focus on the whisper that started it all. It is 865 AD, a year that hangs suspended between the old world of isolated raids and the coming storm of total conquest. Ragnar, the legendary Viking chieftain who had scourged the coasts of France and England, had been captured not in a grand duel of armies, but in a skirmish, his luck finally running dry on the shores of Northumbria. King Ella, a usurper desperate to legitimize his shaky claim to the throne, saw in Ragnar not just a prisoner, but a trophy, a symbol of the pagan chaos that terrified Christendom. To simply behead such a man would have been too clean, too honorable. Ella wanted humiliation. He wanted to strip the myth of its armor and show his subjects that the terror of the north was mortal, breakable, and flesh. And so, the pit was dug. Historians still argue whether the snake pit was a literal hole filled with vipers gathered from the English countryside, or if it is a poetic invention of the sagas, a metaphor for a deep, subterranean dungeon filled with the snakes of cold, hunger, and despair. But in the landscape of our story tonight, let us imagine the snakes are real, their dry hissing a chorus to the king's cruelty. Ahela stood above, watching the man who had sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris be reduced to a figure writhing in the mud. He expected begging. He expected the shattering of the Viking spirit. But the silence of the aftermath tells us he received neither. The accounts say that Ragnar, stripped of the magical silk shirt his wife Aslaug had woven to protect him, did not cry out for mercy. Instead, he laughed. It was a dark, gurgling sound that rose from the bottom of the pit, echoing off the stone walls and chilling the guards who stood watch. With his final breath, Ragnar delivered a line that would travel faster than any ship, a prophecy that would bind his sons together in a pact of blood. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered, he wheezed, his voice carrying the weight of a curse. Aella, standing high above in the safety of the open air, likely dismissed these words as the delirium of a dying man, the last spiteful attempt to inflict pain where swords could no longer reach. He heard the grunt of piglets and thought of disorganized, grieving children. He did not understand that the piglets were full-grown wolves, commanders of armies, and tacticians of ruthless efficiency. He did not see the strings of fate he had just pulled, sending a vibration across the North Sea that would wake the sleeping giants of Scandinavia. As the life left Ragnar's body, the energy in Northumbria shifted imperceptibly. The king returned to his hall, perhaps feeling a hollow sort of triumph, unaware that the silence outside was not peace, but the quiet of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. Inside the castle, the mood would have been strange, a mixture of celebration and unease. The servants, moving through the drafty corridors with flagons of ale, might have exchanged glances, sensing that the execution was too gruesome, too personal. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from witnessing excessive cruelty, a primal understanding that the universe demands balance, and that such an act invites a counterweight of equal violence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the keep, carrying the scent of the sea, the highway of the enemy. The body in the pit was left to the elements, a final insult, but the spirit of the event had already escaped. News in the 9th century did not travel by wire or signal, but by the slow, reliable rhythm of gossip, trade, and song. Sailors leaving the ports of Northumbria, merchants crossing the borders into Mercia, and spies loyal to other kings whispered the tale. "The old boar is dead," they would say in hushed tones over dying embers in taverns, thrown to the snakes by Aella. And like a dark flock of birds, these words flew east. They crossed the grey, heaving expanse of the ocean, hopping from the rigging of one longship to another, until they reached the ears of those who were never meant to hear them. We must understand the gravity of this moment in the timeline of history. Up until this point, Viking raids were largely economic ventures. They were seasonal, predictable, and transactional. Men came, they took silver and slaves, and they left to winter in their own lands. But the death of Ragnar changed the currency of the conflict. It removed the logic of profit and replaced it with the logic of emotion. Allah had made the mistake of making the war personal. He had insulted a lineage that claimed descent from Odin himself. As the moon climbs higher over the silent pit in Northumbria, casting long warped shadows across the grass, the scene shifts in our minds. We drift away from the damp English soil, floating over the white-capped waves of the North Sea, moving towards the fjords where the air is sharper, colder, and filled with the smoke of hearth fires that burn with a different purpose. The silence of the pit is left behind, but it is replaced by a different kind of silence. The silence of a messenger standing in the doorway of a great hall, breathless, with salt on his skin and disaster on his tongue. The piglets are about to hear of the boar's end, and the grunting Aella, mocked, is about to become a roar that will shake the foundations of the Saxon world. The story of the Great Heathen Army does not begin with a fleet launching. It begins here, in the quiet dark, with a seed of hate planted deep in the Northumbrian earth, watered by a king who thought he was ending a story, when in fact, he was writing the first chapter of his own demise. Inside the great hall of the sons of Ragnar, the air is thick with the scent of roasted venison, pine resin, and the warm animal smell of furs piled high on benches. A stark contrast to the cold, wet grave we just left in Northumbria. Here, the firelight dances against the timber walls, casting flickering orange shadows that stretch and recede like breathing giants, illuminating the faces of men who are currently at peace. It is a domestic scene, almost disarming in its normalcy. In the center of the room, seated at a heavy oaken table carved with the interlacing beasts of Norse mythology, sits Bjorn Ironside, his broad shoulders relaxed, his attention fixed on a game of Nefatafel, or Viking chess. Opposite him, perhaps, sits Hvitserk, or a trusted lieutenant, moving the bone-playing pieces across the checkered board in a battle of wits that mimics the strategies of war. To the side, lounging with a deceptive air of lethargy, is Sigurd, known by the distinct mark in his pupil as Snake in the Eye. He is engaged in a mundane act of personal grooming, using a small, razor-sharp seating knife to pare his fingernails, the scraping sound rhythmic and hypnotic in the quiet of the hall. The mood is one of idle power, the downtime of apex predators who have no reason to fear the dark. But the door creaks open, letting in a draught of icy wind and a messenger whose silhouette is framed by the grey twilight outside. The chatter in the hall dies down, not instantly, but in a ripple of silencing conversations, as heads turn to look at the man who stands dripping on the threshold. He does not need to speak for them to know that the world has shifted. It is written in the pallor of his skin and the way he refuses to meet the eyes of the sons of the legend. When he finally speaks, his voice is a tremor, reciting the tale of the Northumbrian pit, the vipers, and the final mocking laughter of their father. He delivers the prophecy of the piglets and the old boar, the words hanging in the smoke-filled air like a physical weight. What happens next is not an explosion of shouting or the overturning of tables, but a reaction that is far more terrifying because of its quiet intensity. We witness the birth of a trauma that bypasses grief and goes straight to a cold, reptilian rage. Sigurd, listening to the description of his father's agony, does not look up. He continues the rhythmic motion of the knife against his thumb, but his gaze unfocuses, drifting into a 1,000-yard stare that sees through the walls of the longhouse and across the sea. In this trance of fury, he pares the nail, but he does not stop at the quick. He continues to cut, the blade slicing into the skin, through the flesh, and down to the bone of his own finger. He does not flinch. He does not gasp. The pain is utterly registered, eclipsed by the magnitude of the news, as if his body has ceased to belong to him and has become merely an instrument of the vengeance to come. The blood wells up, dark and rich in the firelight, dripping onto the floorboards. But Sigurd's Snake in the Eye simply stares at nothing, the knife still in his hand, the physical damage ignored in favor of the spiritual wound that has just been inflicted. Across the table, Bjorn Ironside's reaction is equally visceral, a display of latent strength triggered by emotional shock. He is holding a playing piece, a king or a defender carved from hard bone between his thumb and forefinger. As the messenger repeats Isla's taunts, Bjorn's hand tightens. It is an involuntary spasm, the muscles of his forearm cording like steel cables under his skin. The hall is so silent that the sound is audible, a sharp, dry crack that sounds like a pistol shot. The solid bone piece explodes in his grip, shattering into sharp fragments that drive themselves deep into the meat of his palm. Blood begins to seep from his clenched fist, mixing with the white dust of the destroyed game piece, dripping onto the chessboard in a macabre mingling of play and violence. He does not open his hand. He holds the pain tight, grounding himself in it, using it to cauterize the grief before it can make him weak. These two images, the knife cutting to the bone and the chess piece pulverized, are not merely dramatic embellishments. They are the signals of a psychological break. The sons of Ragnar are not just angry. They have been fundamentally altered. In this moment, the concept of raiding dies. The Viking Age of hit-and-run attacks, of seeking silver to buy farms, of summer excursions for glory, is effectively over. In its place, something new and terrible is born. This is the genesis of the Missile here, the Great Heathen Army. It is a force mobilized not for treasure, not for slaves, and not for exploration, but for the total systematic extermination of the men who killed their father. It is a shift from economic warfare to existential warfare. Historians still argue whether these specific traumatic reactions are literal historical events recorded by eyewitnesses, or if they are the literary devices of 12th century saga writers designed to externalize the internal fury of the brothers. Yet, the distinction matters little to the narrative truth. Whether the bone broke or not, the piece was shattered. The outcome was a mobilization of unprecedented scale. Messengers were sent out that very night, not just to the local chieftains, but to every harbor in Scandinavia. The call went out to Norway, to the Swedish coasts, to the Norse settlements in Ireland, and to the roving bands of mercenaries in Frisia. The promise was not payment in gold, though that would come, but the promise of a reckoning. Rivals who had spent years fighting each other laid down their feuds to join this cause. Men who had retired from the sea took their axes down from the walls. The piglets were gathering, and they were bringing the rest of the farmyard with them. The atmosphere in the longhouse shifts from the warm, drowsy comfort of the evening to a cold, sharp purpose. The game of chess is forgotten, the pieces left in disarray, a metaphor for the English kingdoms that are about to be upended. Bjorn opens his hand, shaking the bloody shards onto the table, his face a mask of stone. Sigurd wraps his bleeding finger in a scrap of linen, the pain finally registering, but acknowledged only as a fuel for his focus. There is no weeping here, no eulogies spoken in trembling voices. There is only the grim calculation of logistics. How many ships, how many spears, how many days to cross the water. The silence that follows the messenger's tale is not the silence of the grave, but the silence of a held breath before a scream. The decision has been made. The dragon ships will be pulled from the sand, the sails will be stitched, and the whetstones will sing against the steel of swords until the edges are keen enough to split a hair. The sons of Ragnar have accepted the challenge, and in doing so, they have doomed thousands to death. As the fire burns down to embers, the shadows in the hall seem to lengthen, stretching out like the dark clouds that will soon gather over the coast of East Anglia, heralding a storm that will not break for 14 years. The command issued in the firelight of the longhouse did not stay within the walls of the keep. It traveled like a vibration through the bedrock of the north, waking the dormant violence in every harbor and homestead from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. If the death of Ragnar was the spark, this section of our story is the gathering of the fuel, a process that transformed the scattered individualistic energy of the Viking world into a singular unified machine of war. Imagine standing on the coast of Denmark in late 865 AD. Usually, the horizon would be dotted with the occasional fishing boat or a solitary trading vessel. But as the weeks turned into months, the seascape began to change in a way that defied nature. Ships began to arrive, not in twos or threes, but in scores. They came from the deep, jagged fjords of Norway, slipping out of the mist like ghosts. They came from the Swedish riverlands, their hulls scarred from shallow waters. They came from the pirate ports of Dublin and the windswept islands of the Orkneys. It was a magnetic pull, drawing rivals and mercenaries, kings and exiles, all lured by the gravity of the sons of Ragnar and the promise of a war that would end all wars. This was the assembly of the Missel here, the Great Army or Great Host, as the terrified Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later name it. And it was unlike anything the Christian world had ever seen. Before this moment, Viking activity had been like the bite of a mosquito, irritating, painful, potentially deadly, but transient. The Vikings would strike, steal, and vanish before an army could be raised. But as the beaches of Denmark filled with men, it became clear that this was not a raiding party. It was a migration. Walking among the tents that sprang up along the shoreline, you would see the flash of steel, yes, the honing of axes, the oiling of chainmail, the fletching of arrows. But you would also see things that had no place in a raid. You would see smiths setting up portable forges, the ring of their hammers joining the cry of the gulls. You would see women weaving cloaks against the coming English winter, children playing in the sand with wooden swords, and crates of livestock being loaded onto the wider, deeper Nars, ships designed for cargo rather than speed. This army was not packing for a summer trip. They were packing for a lifetime. They were bringing the very roots of their society with them, intending to transplant the North into the soil of England. The logistics of such a gathering are almost impossible to overstate, a feat of organization that belies the stereotype of the wild barbarian. Food had to be preserved, water barrels coopered, and alliances forged between chieftains who, under any other circumstances, would have been at each other's throats. Yet, under the cold, unifying glare of Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, old feuds were suspended in favor of the greater hate. The atmosphere on those beaches must have been electric, a mix of festival and funeral, for many knew they would never see these shores again. Finally, the day of departure arrived. It is a scene that belongs in the deepest galleries of the imagination. The moment the floating city pushed off from the land, hundreds of ships, their prows carved into the shapes of dragons, serpents, and beasts of prey, cut into the grey surf simultaneously. The sound of thousands of oars hitting the water in unison would have been like a heartbeat drumming against the ocean floor. To the observer, the horizon itself seemed to detach and move, a wooden wall of multicolored sails, red and white stripes, raven banners, and symbols of the gods, billowing in the wind. This was the dragon-headed horizon, a terrifying optical illusion where the sea was swallowed by the fleet. As they crossed the North Sea, the water churned into white foam for miles, the wake of one ship bleeding into the next until the ocean looked like a boiling cauldron. The journey was not merely a military maneuver, it was a bridging of worlds. They were carrying not just weapons, but a culture, a language, and a new law that would soon overlay the old Roman roads of Britain. On the other side of the water, on the flat, marshy coast of East Anglia, the air grew heavy. The local watchers, men stationed on the dunes to light beacons in case of trouble, would have stared out at the grey line where the sky met the sea, perhaps squinting against the salt spray. At first, they might have thought it was a storm front, a dark bruising of the lower sky that promised rain. But as the shapes sharpened, as the squares of the sails became distinct, and the dragon heads rose and fell with the swell, the realization would have hit them with the force of a physical blow. This was not a storm of rain and wind. It was a storm of iron and wood. The sheer scale of the fleet rendered the beacons useless. What good is a warning fire when the apocalypse is already washing up on the sand? The Great Heathen Army made landfall not with a chaotic scream of battle, but with the ominous, disciplined crunch of keels hitting the shingle. They did not immediately burn the villages. They did not rush inland to loot the monasteries. That is the mistake of the amateur, and these were professionals led by the mind of Ivar. Instead, they secured the beachhead, unloading the horses, the tools, the women, and the smiths. They established a perimeter, turning the beach into a fortified camp within hours. The residents of East Anglia, trembling in their halls, waited for the attack that did not come. Instead of fire, they saw the smoke of campfires rising in steady, calm columns. Instead of screams, they heard the low, guttural hum of a foreign language drifting on the wind. The Vikings were not there to rush. They were there to suffocate. The landing was a statement. We are here, and we are not leaving. The dragon ships, pulled up onto the sand, looked like a resting pack of beasts, their painted eyes staring inland toward the rich green kingdoms of Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. The terror of the Great Heathen Army lay not just in their violence, which was legendary, but in their patience. They had crossed the sea, not to rob a house, but to evict the tenants. As night fell over the East Anglian coast, the glow of the Viking fires outnumbered the stars. A new constellation burning on the edge of the world, signaling that the island of Britain was no longer an island, but a battlefield where the ghosts of the past and the monsters of the present were about to collide. The silence of the Northumbrian pit had grown into a roar, and the chess piece Bjorn crushed was about to be replaced by real kings on a board that spanned the entire country. The camp that sprawled across the East Anglian coast did not behave like an invading army. It behaved like a heavy, suffocating blanket of snow that had fallen over the kingdom, refusing to melt. As the weeks of late 865 turned into the deep, iron-hard frost of early 866, the Great Heathen Army settled into a terrifying stasis. This is the winter of waiting, a period often glossed over in favor of the battles that followed, yet it is here, in the quiet, frozen months of negotiation and preparation, that the true genius of the invasion revealed itself. The English kings, particularly Edmund of East Anglia, likely expected a sudden chaotic surge, a burning of monasteries followed by a swift departure. They were prepared for a storm. They were not prepared for a siege of the soul. The Vikings simply sat there. They huddled around their fires, the smoke drifting low over the marshes, watching the locals with the unnerving patience of a wolf that knows the deer has nowhere to run. At the center of this stillness sat Ivar the Boneless. To understand the terror of this winter, One must try to visualize the man who orchestrated it. Historians still argue whether the name boneless, Ivar hin beinlausi, referred to a physical condition, such as osteogenesis imperfecta, which would have left his legs brittle and useless, or if it was a cruel, ironic nickname for a man of unnatural flexibility, or perhaps even a metaphor for sexual impotence. In the candlelight of our story, however, let us picture the version that haunts the sagas most deeply. A man whose body was broken, perhaps carried on a shield or a litter, but whose mind was a diamond of flawless, cutting clarity, while his brothers, Bjorn and Sigurd, might have been pacing like caged tigers, eager to test their axes against Saxon skulls. Ivar remained motionless. He understood that fear was a currency more valuable than silver, and he intended to bankrupt England with it before a single arrow was loosed. He knew that by sitting on the doorstep of East Anglia, he was forcing King Edmund into a corner. Edmund could not fight this floating city alone, and so he was forced to treat with them. The negotiations that took place in the damp, foggy no-man's land between the Viking camp and the English settlements were quiet, tense affairs. There was no shouting, only the murmured exchange of demands. Ivar did not ask for the crown of East Anglia, not yet. That would have united the other English kingdoms against him too soon. Instead, he asked for something far more strategic, a request that puzzled the English at first, but would soon reveal its deadly logic. He wanted horses. He demanded that the East Anglians supply his army with mounts. To the English, this might have seemed like a manageable price to pay for peace, a dongeld of livestock rather than gold. They likely believed they were buying their survival, trading their stables to save their lives. They did not realize they were providing the infantry-heavy Vikings with the one thing they lacked: mobility on land. Throughout that long, dark winter, the villagers of East Anglia were forced to bring their prize mares and stallions to the Viking lines. Imagine the sensory dissonance of that exchange. The smell of wet wool and nervous horse sweat, the steam rising from the animals' flanks in the cold air, the muffled thud of hooves on the frozen mud. The Vikings, men of the sea who had spent their lives gripping oars and rigging, began to learn the rhythm of the saddle. They were not becoming cavalry in the traditional sense. They would not charge into battle on horseback like the later knights of France. But they were becoming a dragoon force, capable of moving across the landscape with terrifying speed, dismounting only to fight. By handing over their horses, the East Anglians were essentially fitting wheels to the Viking war machine. They watched as their own animals were branded with foreign runes, their manes braided by rough hands, transformed from tools of agriculture into engines of war. The atmosphere in the Viking camp during these months was one of industrial focus. The smiths we saw on the beach were not idle. The ring of hammers on anvils became the heartbeat of the winter. They were shoeing horses, repairing mail, and forging thousands of arrowheads. The women mended tunics and preserved meat, ensuring the army would not starve when they marched into the wasteland of war. It was a society functioning in perfect, ominous harmony, fueled by the singular goal of revenge. Meanwhile, to the north, in the kingdom of Northumbria, the silence must have been agonizing. King Aelle knew they were there. He knew the sons of Ragnar had landed, but the attack did not come. Every day that passed, with the sun rising on a peaceful horizon, was another turn of the screw. Was today the day? Was tonight the night? Ivar was letting the anticipation rot the morale of his enemies. He was letting the rumors of the great host grow in the telling, so that by the time his army finally moved, they would be fighting men already half defeated by their own nightmares. As the winter solstice passed and the days began to lengthen, a subtle shift occurred in the camp. The relaxed posture of the waiting months tightened into readiness. The snow began to melt, turning the ground into a slush of mud and ice. But the Vikings did not mind the wet. They were creatures of the water, after all. The horses were ready. The men were restless. The plan, incubated in the cold dark, was ready to hatch. Ivar's target was finally whispered through the ranks. York, Eoforwich, the capital of the north. It was a city of Roman walls and Saxon pride, a prize that sat at the confluence of rivers, currently distracted by the civil war between Isla and Osbert. Ivar had waited for the perfect moment, watching from afar as the Northumbrians exhausted themselves, fighting each other. And now, as the first buds of spring struggled to push through the frost, he decided it was time to intervene. The departure from East Anglia was not a chaotic exodus, but a fluid transformation. The floating city became a river of steel flowing north. The East Anglians, watching from behind their shuttered windows, must have felt a sickening mix of relief and guilt. The locusts were leaving their fields, yes, but they were heading toward their neighbors, riding the very horses that had been raised in East Anglian pastures. The sound of the army moving out would have been a low, continuous rumble. A vibration felt in the soles of the feet, thousands of hooves, the creak of leather, the clinking of weapons, a sound that faded slowly into the northern mist, leaving a silence behind that was not peaceful, but empty. They had survived the winter of waiting, but they had done so by sharpening the knife that was about to be drawn across the throat of the north. The landscape they rode through was waking up. The bare branches of the trees were just beginning to show the hazy green of new growth, and the rivers were running high with meltwater. But the beauty of the English spring was lost on the Great Heathen Army. They did not see the flowers. They saw the terrain. They saw the Roman roads, the streets left behind by the legions, which provided a paved highway straight to the heart of their enemy. Ivar, perhaps riding in a chariot or carried on a litter between two steady horses, led them not with shouts, but with the quiet certainty of a chess master, making a move he had planned 20 turns ago. He knew the calendar as well as he knew the sword. He knew that the Christians had their holy days, their times of feasting and distraction. He was counting the days until All Saints, a date that would become synonymous not with prayer, but with blood. The winter was over. The waiting was done. The avalanche, having gathered its mass and weight in the silence of East Anglia, was beginning its slide. The road to the north was old long before the Vikings ever set foot on it. It was a scar of stone laid down by the legions of Rome, a straight grey arrow shooting through the heart of Britain, ignoring the curves of the hills and the wanderings of the rivers. On November 1st, 866, this road, known as Ermine Street, trembled under a new kind of weight. If you were a shepherd tending your flock on the rolling moors of Yorkshire that morning, you would have felt the earth shaking before you heard the sound. It was a low, rhythmic thunder, the combined percussion of thousands of horses moving at a hard pace. This was the Great Heathen Army, transformed by the horses of East Anglia into a terrifyingly mobile force, surging toward the capital of the north with the speed of a brush fire. They rode not to fight from the saddle, but to arrive before the rumors of their coming could catch up to them. Their destination was York, or Eoforwick, as the Saxons called it, a city that sat atop the ghosts of the Roman Iberacum, its ancient walls crumbling but still formidable, rising out of the mist at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. Inside those walls, the atmosphere was not one of war, but of reverence. It was All Saints' Day. The bells of the minster were ringing, a slow, mournful tolling that drifted over the thatched roofs and the stone ruins, calling the faithful to prayer. The city was unarmed. The swords were hanging on the walls of the mead halls. The mail shirts were packed away in chests. The heavy oak gates, usually barred against the night, stood open to welcome pilgrims from the countryside. The Northumbrians were safe, or so they believed, protected by the distance from the coast, by the sanctity of the holy day, and by the sheer improbability of an invasion so late in the year. Ivar the Boneless had counted on this. His mind, cold and precise, understood the rhythm of the Christian calendar better than many Christians did. He knew that on this specific day, the ealdormen, the thegns, and the high-ranking officials, the very men who would organize a defense, would be clustered together inside the cathedrals, their heads bowed, their hands empty of weapons, their minds turned towards the afterlife rather than the horizon. He was bringing the afterlife to them. As the Viking vanguard crested the final ridge overlooking the city, the sun was likely pale and watery, offering no warmth. They did not pause to set up camp. They did not sound war horns to announce their challenge. To do so would have been honorable by the standards of the duel, but this was not a duel. It was an execution. The army poured down the slope, a dark, fluid mass of leather and iron, abandoning their horses just outside the range of the city's vision to storm the gates on foot. The speed of the transition from riding to running was a drill they had perfected over the winter, a seamless shift from travel to violence. The first sign that something was wrong inside York would have been the change in the sound of the city, the chanting of the mass, the low murmur of the markets, the ringing of the bells. All of it was suddenly undercut by a rising scream from the gates. And then, the wolves were among the sheep. The Vikings breached the city not with siege engines, but with momentum. They flooded through the open gates, moving through the narrow, twisting streets like a flash flood. The resistance was sporadic and confused. A city guard, perhaps dozing on a bench or chewing on a piece of bread, would have looked up to see a nightmare rushing at him. Bearded giants in wolfskins, axes raised, eyes devoid of mercy. There was no time to form a shield wall. There was no time to rally. The battle for York was won before the first blow was struck, simply because the Northumbrians could not comprehend that the enemy was already there. The violence that followed was precise. Ivar had likely given orders to secure the strategic points, the granaries, the armories, and the high walls. The slaughter was directed at the leadership. The doors of the churches were thrown open, not by latecomers to the Mass, but by men who worshipped a different pantheon. Imagine the sensory shock of that moment, the heavy smell of frankincense and beeswax candles suddenly mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the cold, fresh air of the open door. The light of the stained glass and the flickering candles catching the dull gleam of a wet axe. The chanting faltering, then stopping, replaced by the heavy breathing of the invaders. The leaders of York, the men who had been squabbling over the civil war between Kings Aella and Osbert, found themselves unified at last, huddled together in terror, as the heathens they had dismissed as mere pirates stood over them. Historians still argue whether the ease of York's capture was due to a secret betrayal by a faction loyal to the deposed King Osbert, hoping the Vikings would eliminate his rival Aella, or simply the sheer terrifying speed of Ivar's advance, which outpaced the news of his own coming. Some suggest that the gates were opened from the inside, that gold had changed hands in the dark, but it is equally likely that the incompetence of the divided Northumbrian leadership simply left the door unlocked. Regardless of the method, the result was total. By sunset on All Saints' Day, the city of York, the jewel of the north, the seat of archbishops and kings, belonged to the sons of Ragnar. The bells had stopped ringing. The streets were quiet again, save for the dragging of bodies and the patrolling steps of the new masters. But here is the crucial detail that separates Ivar from a mere raider. He did not burn York. A common Viking raid would have ended with the city in flames, the sky black with smoke as the plunderers sailed away. But Ivar looked at the Roman walls, the stone towers, and the strategic position between the rivers, and he saw a fortress. He saw a base of operations. He saw a trap. He ordered the fires to be extinguished. He ordered the fortifications to be repaired and strengthened. He did not want to destroy the city. He wanted to wear it like armor. He knew that the capture of York would finally force the two warring kings, Aella and Osbert, to stop fighting each other and turn their attention to him. He was counting on it. He occupied the houses of the dead nobility, his warriors sleeping in the beds of the men they had just killed, eating the feast that had been prepared for all saints. As night fell over the conquered city, the Vikings stood on the walls, looking out into the darkness of the surrounding countryside. They knew the response would come. They knew the piglets had kicked the hornet's nest, but they were no longer exposed on a beach or moving through open fields. They were behind stone. They had food. They had the high ground. Inside the great hall of York, Ivar the Boneless likely sat in the high seat, perhaps running a hand over the carved wood, a ghost of a smile on his face. He had taken the first major piece on the board. Now he would wait for the kings to come to him. The civil war outside would pause, the shock would turn to anger, and the armies of Northumbria would gather. But Ivar had already written the script for the next act. He had turned the city of York into a kill box, and he was just waiting for his enemies to step inside. The silence of the night was not the peace of the holy day. It was the quiet of a snare that has been set, waiting for the prey to put its foot in the wire. The winter that followed the capture of York was a season of grinding teeth and swallowed pride for the Northumbrians, a time when the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the inevitable collision. For 4 long months, the Vikings sat behind the Roman walls of the city, their fires burning like taunting eyes in the dark, while outside the impossible was happening. King Aella and King Osbert, men who had spent years trying to murder one another for the crown, were forced into a room together. We can imagine the tension of that meeting, the heavy silence broken only by the crackle of a hearth fire, the air thick with mutual hatred that had to be choked down for the sake of survival. They were sworn enemies, yet the presence of the Great Heathen Army was a threat that eclipsed their civil war. It was a cancer that made their political fever seem trivial. Reluctantly, with hands that likely hovered near the hilts of their swords, they agreed to a truce. They combined their forces, merging the royal housecarls of 2 rival courts into a single uneasy army, bolstered by the Fyrd, the common levy of farmers and laborers called up from the fields to defend their homes. It was a massive force, numerically superior to the Vikings, driven by a righteous desperation to reclaim their capital and drive the pagans back into the sea. They spent the early spring gathering their strength, sharpening their spears, and praying for victory. They believed that God was on their side, and perhaps to ensure his favor, they chose a date for the attack that felt propitious: Palm Sunday, March 21st, 867. Just as they had been attacked on All Saints' Day, they would retake their city on the day celebrating Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. It was a poetic symmetry that Ivar the Boneless likely found amusing. As the Northumbrian army marched on York, the mood must have been one of grim confidence. They saw the city ahead, its walls patched and defended. But they knew the layout. They knew the weaknesses. To them, the Vikings were raiders, trapped in a cage of stone, cut off from their ships. The Northumbrians believed they were the hunters surrounding a cornered animal. They did not understand that a cornered animal is the most dangerous thing in the world, especially when that animal has had 4 months to sharpen its claws. The assault began with a roar that shook the birds from the trees. The Northumbrians attacked the walls with a ferocity born of humiliation. They brought ladders, rams, and the sheer weight of bodies, pushing against the stone defenses. Historians still argue whether the Vikings intentionally allowed the breach, or if the Northumbrian fury simply overwhelmed the defenders. But looking at the tactical mind of Ivar, it is hard to believe in accidents. The chronicle tells us that the Northumbrians broke into the city. The heavy timber gates splintered. The defenders on the ramparts seemed to melt away, retreating into the shadow of the interior. A cheer must have gone up from the Saxon ranks, a raw, guttural cry of triumph. They were in. The shell was cracked. They poured through the breach, like a river bursting a dam, thousands of men rushing into the streets of York, their blood hot, their eyes scanning for loot and vengeance. But as the rear guard pushed the vanguard forward, the triumph began to sour into confusion. York was not an open field. It was a labyrinth. It was a palimpsest of history, a tangle of ancient Roman grids, overbuilt with chaotic Saxon alleyways, timber overhangs, and winding paths that turned back on themselves. In the open field, the Saxon shield wall was a formidable engine of war, a locked line of wood and iron that could grind an enemy to dust. But here, in the intestines of the city, there was no room for a shield wall. The long spears of the Northumbrians became liabilities, dangling in the thatch of low roofs, clattering against stone walls, preventing the men from turning or maneuvering. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, a dense mob pressing forward into a silence that was suddenly, violently broken. The trap snapped shut. The Vikings had not fled. They had merely repositioned. They were on the rooftops. They were in the cellarways. They were behind barricades thrown up in the narrow choke points of the streets. From above, a rain of slate, stone, and arrows fell into the packed mass of the Northumbrian army. From the alleys, Viking shock troops armed with short axes and heavy sea axes, weapons perfectly designed for the telephone booth intimacy of urban combat, surged into the flanks of the disorganized Saxons. The kill box of York became a sensory nightmare. The screams of men in the back pushing forward mixed with the screams of men in the front trying to retreat, creating a deadly crush where breath was as scarce as hope. The mud of the streets, churned up by thousands of boots, turned into a red slurry. It was not a battle. It was a butchery. King Osbert, fighting in the thick of the press, realized too late that he had led his men into a meat grinder. Cut off from his guards, unable to swing his sword in the crush, he was dragged down. There was no noble duel, no final words recorded for history. Just the brutal reality of a king trampled into the muck of his own city. His life ended by a nameless axe in the chaos of a street fight. His death sent a shockwave through the ranks, a ripple of panic that shattered whatever cohesion remained. The Northumbrians broke. They tried to flee, but the breach they had entered through was clogged with their own dead and the pressing weight of those still trying to get in. In the center of this swirling hell, King Aella found himself isolated. His housecarls lay dead around him, their bodies forming a grim rampart that had failed to hold back the tide. He fought, likely with the desperation of a man who knows that death is the better option compared to what awaits him if he is taken. But the orders given by the sons of Ragnar were specific. Do not kill Aella. The Vikings surged around him, taking the blows, absorbing the losses, until they could get close enough to grapple. Hands grabbed his tunic, his arms, his hair. He was pulled from his feet, his sword wrenched from his grip, his armor stripped away until he was kneeling in the bloody mire, panting, bruised, but alive. The battle noise began to recede, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic banging of shields, the Viking signal of victory. The surviving Northumbrians were fleeing into the countryside, but the eyes of the Great Heathen Army were fixed on one man. Ivar the Boneless, perhaps carried through the carnage on his litter or leaning heavily on a staff, would have approached the captive king. We can imagine the look that passed between them, the stare of a son who has crossed an ocean to answer a laugh from a snake pit. Aella, the man who had thrown Ragnar to the vipers to prove a point, now looked up into the faces of the piglets and saw that the prophecy was not a metaphor. It was a promise. The city of York, now quiet save for the groans of the dying, belonged completely to the Danes. The bodies of the Northumbrian army clogged the streets, a testament to the tactical genius of the ambush. But they were just scenery for the main event. Aella was not executed there in the heat of the moment. He was bound, treated with a mocking deference, and kept safe. His death needed to be more than just an ending. It needed to be a message written in blood for all of England to read. As the sun set on Palm Sunday, casting long shadows over the broken gates of York, the preparations began for a ritual that would stain the pages of history with a horror so profound that scholars would debate its reality for 1,000 years. The battle was over. The theater of cruelty was about to begin. The procession that led King Aella out of the city of York was not a march of triumph, but a solemn funeral rite for a man who was still breathing. They took him away from the noise of the occupation, away from the smell of the burning fires and the crowded streets, leading him to a high ridge overlooking the city, a place where the wind whipped the grass flat and the sky felt dangerously close to the earth. The location was chosen with the same precise theatricality that Ivar applied to warfare. This was not just an execution. It was a stage. Aella, stripped to the waist, shivered in the biting northern air, his skin pale against the grey tumult of the clouds. He was forced to his knees, his hands bound, facing the vast, rolling landscape of the kingdom he had failed to defend. Behind him, stood the sons of Ragnar, Ivar, Bjorn, Sigurd, and Ubbe, standing like pillars of judgment, their shadows stretching long over the grass. The tools they held were not the swords of battle, but the implements of a carpenter or a butcher, a heavy hammer, a sharp chisel, and a knife with a blade as thin as a leaf. The silence on that ridge was absolute, heavy, with a gravity that pressed against the eardrums. The Vikings who had gathered to watch formed a wide circle, their faces respectful, almost reverent. They were not here to cheer, they were here to witness a sacrament. This was the moment the blood eagle would be carved into history. Historians still argue whether this ritual, known in Old Norse as blodern, was a literal anatomical dismantling of a living man or a mistranslation of a poetic metaphor referring simply to leaving a slashed corpse face down for the carrion birds to feast upon. Some scholars suggest that the graphic details were invented centuries later by Christian monks desperate to paint the Vikings as demons, or by saga writers eager to glorify the ruthlessness of their ancestors. But in the flickering candlelight of our story, we must walk the path the legends laid down, accepting the horror as the reality these men believed in. If the blood eagle was real, it was the most terrifying masterpiece of the Viking Age, a ritual designed to transform a victim into a symbol of Odin himself. The procedure began with Hela being staked to the ground, face down, his back exposed to the sky. Ivar, or perhaps a designated executioner known for his steady hand, would have knelt beside the king. The first cut was not a hack, but a surgical incision, tracing the line of the spine from the shoulder blades down to the lower back, parting the skin to reveal the muscle and bone beneath. The only sound would have been the wind and the wet, tearing noise of the knife. Then came the hammer and chisel. This was the part that required the strength of a blacksmith and the precision of a surgeon. The ribs were severed from the spine one by one, the bone cracking with a dry snap that echoed across the ridge. It was a dismantling of the cage that held the king's life. Once the ribs were detached, they were bent outward, pulled open like the shutters of a window or the unfurling wings of a great bird. The agony of such an act is beyond the capacity of language to describe. It is a pain that erases the self, leaving only raw, white noise. But the ritual demanded that the victim remain silent, for to cry out was to show weakness, though it is unlikely any man could endure this without the mercy of fainting. With the chest cavity open to the air, the final grotesque transformation took place. The lungs were pulled from the body, draped over the spread ribs, so that they rested on the king's shoulders. As Ella took his final ragged gasps, the lungs would inflate and deflate, causing the wings to flutter with a macabre semblance of life. In his death throes, the king of Northumbria was made to look like a bird of prey taking flight, a crimson eagle perched on the edge of the world. This was the answer to the snake pit. Aela had used the lowest of creatures, the viper, to kill Ragnar in the dark of the earth. The sons of Ragnar used the highest of creatures, the eagle, to send Aela to the gods under the open sky. It was a symmetrical violence, a balancing of the cosmic scales that the Vikings held dear. As the movement in the lungs finally ceased and the king's body went still, the gathered warriors would have seen it, not just as torture, but as an offering. The blood eagle was a dedication to Odin, the All-Father, the god of war and poetry, who himself had hung from a tree and sacrificed an eye for wisdom. By carving the eagle into Ayala's back, they were sending a message to the heavens that the debt was paid. The body was left there, a terrifying scarecrow on the ridge, visible to anyone who dared to look up from the city below. The birds, the real eagles and ravens, would eventually come to claim their likeness, descending from the grey clouds to pick the bones clean. The psychological impact of this act on the remaining kingdoms of England cannot be overstated. The news of the blood eagle travelled south faster than the army ever could. It arrived in the courts of Mercia and East Anglia, not as a military report, but as a ghost story. It whispered that these were not men who could be bought or reasoned with. These were men who turned kings into art. The terror paralyzed the will to resist. In Mercia, the news likely caused men to look at their own ribs and shudder. In Wessex, the young Prince Alfred would have heard the tale and understood that a new age of darkness had descended, one that required a new kind of light to combat it. The sons of Ragnar washed their hands of the blood, their duty to their father fulfilled. The old boar had been avenged, but the momentum of the Great Heathen Army was too great to stop. They had tasted the total collapse of a kingdom, and they found they had an appetite for more. The vengeance mission was ostensibly over, but the conquest had only just begun. The eagle on the ridge did not mark the end. It marked the turning point where the raid became an occupation. As the twilight deepened over Yorkshire, the silhouette of the broken king faded into the night, but the shadow it cast would stretch across the entirety of the British Isles, darkening the dreams of every crowned head for a generation. The silence returned to the ridge, but it was a changed silence. The silence of a land that has seen the unthinkable and knows that it can happen again. The shadow of the eagle on the ridge did not stay in the north. It lengthened, stretching south like a stain seeping across a map, until it touched the very shores where the nightmare had begun 3 years earlier. In the late autumn of 869 AD, the Great Heathen Army turned its back on the conquered lands of Northumbria and marched back to East Anglia, the kingdom that had unwittingly armed them with horses during the winter of waiting. The return of the Vikings to East Anglia was not a homecoming. It was a harvest. The king of East Anglia, Edmund, was a man of a different caliber than the warring brothers of the north. He was young, devout, and ruled a land of marshes and mist, a kingdom that felt more like a sanctuary than a fortress. When the great host arrived this time, they did not come to trade for ponies. They came to establish a dominion that required total submission, not just of land, but of the soul. The army set up camp at Thetford, seizing the town with the casual ease of a giant stepping on an anthill. The message sent to King Edmund was simple, brutal, and devoid of the nuance of diplomacy. Bow to Ivar, renounce your Christian God, and you may live as a puppet king under the shadow of Odin. It was a test of faith as much as a test of politics. Ivar, with his cold curiosity, seemed intent on seeing just how far the Christian spine would bend before it broke. He was offering Edmund a choice between survival and salvation, a dichotomy that the Viking mind, pragmatic and glory-focused, likely viewed with contemptuous amusement. But Edmund surprised him. Edmund did not flee to the continent as others had. He did not empty his treasury to pay another Danegeld, knowing that gold only bought time, not safety. Instead, he gathered what forces he could and met the Vikings in battle, likely near Thetford. Historians still argue whether Edmund was captured after a valiant but doomed military defeat in the field, or if he offered himself up voluntarily to prevent the slaughter of his people, walking into the Viking camp like a lamb into a den of wolves. The outcome, however, remains the undisputed tragedy of the East Anglian Church. Edmund was taken alive. He was brought before Ivar and his brother Ubbi, stripped of his royal finery and bound in chains. The scene that followed is one of the most enduring images of English martyrdom, a moment where the violence of the invasion collided head-on with the stoicism of the faithful. Ivar demanded that Edmund deny Christ. He wanted to break the king before he killed him, to prove that the gods of the north were stronger than the nailed god of the south. But Edmund, his face perhaps bruised, but his eyes clear, refused. He spoke of an eternal kingdom that Ivar's axes could not touch, a defiance that must have infuriated the boneless, who dealt only in the currencies of flesh and fear. The execution that Ivar ordered was designed to mock the very faith Edmund clung to. It was not the ritualistic surgery of the blood eagle, but a slow, piercing game of cruelty. They dragged the young king to a wood, perhaps a sacred grove that had once known druidic whispers, and tied him fast to a stout oak tree. The image is stark, the pale figure of the king against the rough, dark bark of the ancient wood, the grey winter sky above, and the line of Viking archers forming up at a leisurely distance. They did not fire all at once. This was target practice. They loosed their arrows one by one, aiming not for the heart or the head, but for the limbs, the shoulders, the meat of the thighs, places that would cause agony without granting the release of death. The thrum of the bowstrings and the wet thud of the shafts hitting their mark became a rhythmic torture. The chroniclers, searching for a way to describe the horror, wrote that Edmund was so riddled with arrows that he came to resemble a hedgehog or a thistle, his body a pincushion of Viking shafts. Through it all, the legends say he did not scream for mercy, but continued to chant the name of Jesus, a soft, broken prayer that floated on the wind, infuriating his captors. The hedgehog imagery is powerful because it dehumanizes the victim, turning a man into an object, a grotesque curiosity. Yet, in his endurance, Edmund was becoming something more than a man. He was becoming a myth. Ivar, realizing that pain would not silence the prayer, finally grew bored with the game. He signaled for the end. A swordsman stepped forward, the steel flashing in the low light, and with a single stroke, severed Edmund's head from his body. The chanting stopped. The king was dead. But the Vikings, perhaps sensing that they had created a martyr, tried to erase him. They took the king's head and threw it deep into the dense, bramble-choked undergrowth of the forest, far from the body, intending for it to be lost to the wolves and the rot, denying him a Christian burial. They wanted him to be forgotten, to be just another dead Saxon in the mud. But in doing so, they inadvertently planted the seed of a legend that would outlast their own empire. The story goes that when Edmund's followers later crept into the woods to find their king, calling out, "Where are you?" a voice answered from the dark, "Here, here, here." They followed the sound to find a great grey wolf, a beast of the forest, guarding the severed head between its paws, protecting it from other predators until the men could retrieve it. The death of Edmund marked the end of East Anglia as an independent kingdom. It was absorbed into the Danelaw, the land under Viking rule. But the blood of the king seemed to poison the ground for the invaders in a spiritual sense. Edmund became Saint Edmund the Martyr, the patron saint of England long before St. George, and his shrine at Bury St. Edmunds became a place of pilgrimage that would stand for centuries. Ivar had killed the man, but he had strengthened the resolve of the culture he sought to destroy. The Saint and the Arrows became a story told in whispers to stiffen the spines of the resisting Saxons. It taught them that while the Vikings could break the body, there was a part of the English spirit that could catch the arrows and refuse to fall. The Great Heathen Army, having decapitated the leadership of the East, now looked west. They had taken the north, they had taken the east. Now the rich, fertile lands of the Midlands, the kingdom of Mercia, lay open before them. The army packed up its tents, leaving the hedgehog king to the history books, and began the march toward Mercia. The psychological weight of their victories was now their greatest weapon. They were no longer just men. They were the slayers of kings, the carvers of eagles, the makers of martyrs. As they crossed the border into Mercia, the news of Edmund's fate traveled ahead of them like a plague wind. The will to fight was evaporating. The summer of blood was turning into a winter of surrender. The Great Heathen Army was essentially undefeated, a dark juggernaut that seemed to simply roll over the map, erasing borders and rewriting the names of towns in their own tongue. The silence of the East Anglian woods, where the wolf guarded the head, was replaced by the anxious, trembling silence of the Mercian court, where a king named Burgred sat on his throne, listening to the approach of the thunder, wondering if he too would end up as a bird or a beast in the Viking menagerie of death. The arrows had done their work. Now fear would do the rest. The collapse of a kingdom does not always sound like the clash of steel or the crumbling of stone walls. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet, hurried scratching of a quill on parchment, or the soft clink of gold coins being counted into leather bags by trembling hands. As the Great Heathen Army turned its gaze from the blood-soaked woods of East Anglia toward the rolling green heartlands of Mercia, the war shifted from a physical contest to a psychological siege. Mercia was the giant of the English kingdoms, a sprawling territory that controlled the Midlands, rich in trade and history. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a fortress of resistance. But the year was 874 AD, and the circumstances were anything but normal. The air in the Mercian court was thick with the stories of what had happened to the neighbors. King Burgred, sitting on his throne in Tamworth, or perhaps huddled in the royal centre at Repton, looked at the map and saw a terrifying pattern. To the north, King Aella had been carved into an eagle. To the east, King Edmund had been turned into a pincushion. The sons of Ragnar were not just defeating kings. They were making examples of them. Burgred, a man who had ruled for 22 years, suddenly found himself facing a choice that no king should ever have to make. The choice between a glorious, gruesome death or a shameful, quiet survival. The Vikings did not rush into Mercia. They moved with the confident, predatory slouch of a beast that knows the prey is already paralyzed. They made their winter camp at Repton, a site of immense spiritual significance to the Mercian royal line, the burial place of their ancestors. Imagine the calculated insult of this location. The Vikings took over the monastery, digging a D-shaped ditch that cut right through the churchyard. They turned the sanctuary of the dead into a fortress of the living. Modern archaeology at Repton has revealed the grim reality of this occupation. A mass grave containing the bones of hundreds of Viking warriors surrounding the central burial of a high-status chieftain, likely Ivar's brother or or a close lieutenant. But more chillingly, the Vikings broke into the crypts of the Mercian kings. They did not just loot the gold, they camped among the bones. They slept next to the dust of the men who had built the kingdom they were now dismantling. It was a statement of total dominance. We own your land, we own your lives, and we even own your dead. For King Burgred, the news from Repton was the final straw. He was not a young man like Edmund, fueled by the fire of martyrdom. He was tired. He had spent his reign fighting the Welsh to the west and the Vikings to the north, and now the walls were closing in. He looked at his wife, Queen Ethelswith, the sister of the young Alfred of Wessex, and perhaps realized that there was no cavalry coming to save them. Wessex was hunkered down, terrified, waiting for its own turn. Mercia stood alone. The Summer Army, a reinforcement fleet led by a Viking named Bagseg, had arrived to bolster the Great Heathen Army, swelling their numbers to a point that made resistance seem like suicide. The pressure in the court must have been suffocating. The nobles, the ealdormen, the men who should have been sharpening their swords, were instead looking at the floor, looking at their families, looking for a way out. And so, the unthinkable happened. There was no great battle for Mercia. There was no last stand at Tamworth. Instead, there was a negotiation. The details are lost to the silence of the ages, but the outcome tells the story. King Burgred abdicated. He stepped down. He traded his crown for his life. It is a moment of profound melancholy in the English saga. A king walking away from his people because the monster at the door was simply too big to fight. He did not flee into the woods to lead a resistance. He fled into history. He gathered what gold he could, took his wife, and left England forever. He traveled to Rome, the eternal city, seeking sanctuary in the shadow of the Pope, perhaps hoping that the holy ground there would be safer than the blood-soaked soil of Britain. He died there shortly after, a king in exile, buried in the church of Santa Maria in Sassia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records his departure with a dry brevity that masks the tragedy. And the same year Burred passed over sea to Rome. It was the end of an era, a quiet closing of a book that had been open for centuries. But the Vikings were not done with Mercia. They needed the kingdom to function. They needed the crops to be harvested and the taxes to be collected to feed their army. They did not want to rule the day-to-day administration of a vast agrarian land. They wanted the profits without the paperwork. So, in a move of political genius, they installed a replacement. They chose a man named Ceolwulf. Historians still argue whether Ceolwulf was merely a foolish king's thane, as the chronicle claims, a low-born collaborator and a traitor to his people, or a legitimate nobleman from a rival branch of the royal family who was making a pragmatic choice to save Mercia from total destruction. The Saxon chroniclers, riding under the patronage of Alfred, who hated Ceolwulf for collaborating, painted him as a clown, a puppet whose strings were pulled by Viking fingers. But looking back through the twilight of history, we might see him differently, as a man who stepped into the vacuum when the legitimate king fled, a man who agreed to the devil's bargain to keep the villages from burning. Ceolwulf swore oaths to the Vikings. He gave them hostages. He promised that Mercia would be ready for them whenever they needed it. He became the manager of a conquered estate. Under his rule, Mercia was effectively split. The Vikings took the eastern half, the Danelaw settling down to become landlords and farmers. while Coldwulf was left to govern the western half, a rump state that existed only by the grace of the invaders. It was a humiliating peace, but it was peace. The fires in the villages were extinguished, the markets reopened. Life, in a strange, subdued way, went on, but the spirit of the kingdom was broken. The people of Mercia looked to the throne and saw a shadow. They looked to the church and saw the Vikings camped in the crypts. The identity of the Midlands was being rewritten. As the Vikings consolidated their hold on Mercia, a strange atmosphere settled over the island. The Great Heathen Army had effectively decapitated 3 of the 4 great English kingdoms. Northumbria was gone, ruled by puppet kings and Viking warlords. East Anglia was gone, its martyr king headless in the woods. Mercia was gone, its king retired to Rome and its crown worn by a collaborator. The map of England, which had been a colourful patchwork of rival states, was now being painted in a single, monotonous shade of grey. Only one patch of colour remained. To the south, across the River Thames, lay the kingdom of Wessex. It was the last domino standing. The Vikings, resting in their winter camps at Repton, feasting on Mercian beef and drinking Mercian ale, turned their eyes south. They knew it was only a matter of time. They had the momentum of an avalanche. They had the reputation of monsters. They had the foolish king, Ceolwulf, keeping their rear secure. The silence that fell over Mercia after Burgard's departure was the silence of a house that has been emptied. The great halls, where warriors had once boasted of their deeds, were now quiet or filled with the rough laughter of Danish soldiers. The ancient charters were ignored, the old laws forgotten. The avalanche of the Great Heathen Army had reshaped the mountain so completely that the old paths were gone. But in the south, in the marshy lands of Somerset and the rolling downs of Wiltshire, a young man was watching. Alfred, the brother of the Queen who had just fled to Rome, saw the fall of Mercia not as a warning to flee, but as a lesson in what not to do. He saw that paying the Downgeld only bought time, and that time was running out. He saw that running away, like Burgred, meant the death of a culture. As the section closes, we leave the hollowed-out shell of Mercia, the kingdom that gave up, and we drift south across the Thames. The air grows warmer, but the tension grows tighter. The final act is approaching. The piglets have eaten the north, the east, and the Midlands. Now, they are hungry for the south. The board is cleared of all pieces except one king and a few pawns. The game is about to enter its endgame. The year 871 AD is remembered in the Saxon chronicles simply as the year of battles. But in the sensory memory of Wessex, it must have felt like a year of endless thunder. The Great Heathen Army, having digested the rest of England, finally crossed the River Thames, entering the last free kingdom with the confidence of a tide that has never known a seawall. They set up their base at Reading, digging a ditch between the rivers Kennet and Thames, creating a fortress that was seemingly impregnable. For the first time, the piglets were in Alfred's backyard. The young prince, then only 22 years old, alongside his older brother, King Ethelred, fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. They clashed at Ashdown, where the chronicles say the bodies of the Viking earls were strewn over the hillside like logs, a rare and bloody victory for the Saxons. But the Hydra of the Great Heathen Army had too many heads. For every Viking who fell at Ashdown, 2 more seemed to step off the boats. The Saxons won the skirmishes, but they were losing the war of attrition. The year ground on, a blur of mud and blood, until Easter brought a new blow. King Ethelred died. He was not killed by a Viking axe, but by the slow, exhausting fatigue of the campaign, his body simply giving out under the strain. Alfred stood by his brother's grave, the crown of Wessex now resting on his own head, a heavy golden circle that felt less like a symbol of power and more like a target. He was now the king. He was a scholar who preferred Latin texts to shield walls, a man plagued by a mysterious, chronic illness that caused him constant pain, and he was now the only thing standing between the English language and oblivion. His first act as king was to march out to meet the enemy at Wilton, hoping to stem the tide. He failed. The Saxon line crumpled. The Vikings held the field. It was a crushing realization for the young intellectual. Courage was not enough. The mathematics of the war were against him. His army was exhausted, his treasury was draining, and the great host was seemingly infinite. If he continued to fight pitched battles, Wessex would die just like Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. The fire would burn out. So, Alfred did the hardest thing a warrior king can do. He swallowed his pride. He put down his sword and opened his purse. He approached the Viking leadership, now a shifting hydra of warlords, as Ivar had left for Ireland and Bagsec was dead, and offered them the Danegeld. He paid them to leave. To the casual observer, and perhaps to some of his own disgusted ealdormen, this looked like cowardice. It looked like the act of a weakling paying a bully to stop the beating. The Vikings certainly saw it that way. They took the silver, laughed at the bookish king, and agreed to vacate Wessex, turning their attention back to the easier pickings of Mercia and the north. They thought they had broken him. They thought they had turned Alfred into a milk cow that they could milk for silver whenever they pleased. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Alfred did not pay for safety. He paid for time. He treated the Danegeld not as a tribute, but as an investment, a high price paid to buy a 5-year window of silence. As the Vikings marched away, confident in their dominance, Alfred did not go back to his books. He went to work. The period that followed, from roughly 871 to 876, is where the Great, in Alfred's name, was truly earned. While the Vikings spent those years leisurely consolidating the Danelaw, partitioning out the lands of Mercia, and settling down to become farmers and landlords, believing the war was effectively won, Alfred turned Wessex into a construction site. He realized that the old Anglo-Saxon system of defense, the fyrd, or levy, that took weeks to gather, was too slow to catch the lightning-fast Viking raids. He needed a system that was always ready. He began the Burgle Hydage, a massive infrastructure project that redesigned the geography of his kingdom. He ordered the construction of a network of burhs, fortified towns, placed so strategically that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles or a day's march from a place of safety. These were not just castles for the rich. They were shelters for the people and the livestock. He surrounded them with earthen ramparts, palisades, and ditches, turning the open countryside into a grid of strong points. But walls are useless without men to guard them, so he reformed the army itself. He split the fyrd into 2 rotations. Half the men would be at home working the harvest, while the other half were on active duty, manning the walls and patrolling the borders. This meant that for the first time, Wessex had a standing army. The Vikings could no longer rely on the seasonality of war. They could no longer attack during the harvest, knowing the Saxons would be in the fields. Whenever they came, a shield wall would be waiting. But Alfred's vision went even further, extending beyond the land. He looked at the dragon ships that had tormented his people for a century, and he asked a simple, revolutionary question. Why do we wait for them to land? The English were an island people who had forgotten the sea. They fought on foot, terrified of the open water. Alfred decided to change the DNA of his military. He commissioned the construction of ships, long, heavy vessels of his own design, said to be twice as long as the Viking Gnars, swifter and steadier. Historians still argue whether these ships were actually effective in the narrow estuaries, or if they were clumsy prototypes. But the intent was clear. Alfred was building the first English navy. He was trying to intercept the avalanche before it hit the mountain. He hired Frisian mercenaries, experienced sailors, to teach his landlocked farmers how to fight on the waves. He was turning the element of water, which had been the Vikings' highway, into a contested battleground. These 5 years of peace were not quiet. They were the hum of a kingdom reforging itself in the dark. Alfred was racing against the clock, knowing that the silver he had paid would eventually run out, and the wolves would return. He worked with a feverish intensity, translating Latin texts into English so his people could read, establishing laws, and trying to revive the spiritual and intellectual strength of a population beaten down by decades of terror. He believed that the Viking invasions were a divine punishment for the neglect of learning, and so he sharpened the minds of his people, just as he sharpened their spears. He was building a spiritual fortress alongside the physical ones. Meanwhile, in the Danelaw, the Great Heathen Army was undergoing its own transformation, but one of relaxation rather than rigor. Warriors were trading their swords for plowshares, marrying local women, and raising families. The sons of Ragnar were aging or dying. Ivar was in Ireland. Halfdan was fighting in the north. The singular focused diamond of the army was fracturing into smaller, independent warbands and settlements. They were becoming less of an army and more of a population. They had grown comfortable. They looked at Wessex and saw the same weak kingdom they had extorted 5 years prior. They did not see the burrs rising from the earth. They did not see the rotation of the Fird. They did not see the long ships waiting in the harbors. They fell into the trap of arrogance, believing that the piglet's work was done. When the truce finally broke, as Alfred knew it would, the Vikings returned with the expectation of another profitable raid. Guthrum, a new warlord of the Danes, led a force back into Wessex, expecting to slice through the butter. But this time, the knife hit stone. They found the river crossings guarded. They found the towns fortified. They found an army that did not scatter, but stood its ground. The Danegeld had been the most expensive tuition fee in history, but Alfred had learned the lesson well. He had bought the one thing the Vikings could not steal, the opportunity to evolve. The silence of the year of battles had been replaced by the sound of industry, and the kingdom that emerged from that cocoon was no longer prey. It was a predator in its own right, waiting for the invader to make a mistake. The stage was set for the final confrontation, not between a victim and a bully, but between two architects of history, Guthrum, the heir to the heathen army's might, and Alfred, the architect of England. The avalanche had stopped. The mountain was pushing back, while Alfred was busy turning Wessex into a fortress of oak and earth. The architect of his nightmares was undergoing a transformation of his own, not into a king of a new realm, but into a ghost. Ivar the Boneless, the tactical genius who had treated English kings like chess pieces and turned York into a slaughterhouse, quietly vanished from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle after the martyrdom of St. Edmund. He did not die on the battlefield, nor was he driven out by a superior force. He simply walked off the stage. For the Saxons, this disappearance must have been as unsettling as his presence. A monster you cannot see is often more terrifying than one you can. But Ivar had not retired. He had shifted his gaze across the Irish Sea to Dublin, or Dyflin as the Norse called it, a bustling slave port that served as the capital of the Viking world in the west. There he ruled as King Imar, a figure of immense power whose shadow stretched over Ireland, Scotland, and the Hebrides. He was the king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, a title that implies a dominion far greater than the fragmented kingdoms of the English. But the man who had broken so many bones was about to be broken by his own body. The end of Ivar the Boneless is one of history's great grim ironies. He was a man defined by movement, by the lightning strikes of his cavalry, the swift navigation of his ships, and the fluid complexity of his mind. Yet in 873 AD, movement failed him. The annals of Ulster record his death not with the glory of a saga hero falling atop a mountain of slain enemies, but with the cold, clinical note that he died of a sudden, hideous disease. Historians still argue whether this final affliction was a catastrophic flare-up of the congenital condition that had given him his nickname, perhaps a severe form of osteogenesis imperfecta that finally collapsed his skeletal structure, or if it was, a dysentery-like plague that wasted him away in the dark of a Dublin winter. In the candlelight of our narrative, let us imagine it as the former, the boneless curse finally coming due. The man who had carved the blood eagle into the back of a king, exposing the ribs to the air, was now trapped in a body where his own ribs could no longer support the weight of his breath. There were no axes, no shields, no screaming crowds, just the silence of a sick room, the smell of medicinal herbs, and the fading light in the eyes of a man who had burned half of England. But Ivar was not content to let death end his war. The legends that sprang up around his burial speak to a mind that remained strategic even as the brain ceased to function. According to the Ragnar Sona, Tatar, the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ivar gave specific, eerie instructions for his interment. He did not want to be buried in the family mounds of Scandinavia, nor in the consecrated ground of Ireland. He asked to be taken back to England. He commanded his followers to bury him on the coast, at the very edge of the tide, in a place where invading armies were likely to land. His prophecy was as arrogant as it was chilling. As long as my bones watch this coast, he is said to have whispered, no enemy shall successfully conquer this land. He intended to be a skeleton sentry, a necromantic guardian whose reputation alone would act as a shield wall against the future. His men, loyal to the end, obeyed. They carried his body across the Irish Sea, a final mournful crossing for the warlord, and buried him in a mound on the shoreline, possibly overlooking the Humber or the Kentish coast. For nearly 2 centuries, the legend says, the curse held, invaders came, and invaders were repelled. The spirit of Ivar seemed to stand in the surf, invisible and malevolent, tripping the horses of enemies and clouding the minds of rival kings. It is a story that blurs the line between history and ghost story, suggesting that the Great Heathen Army never really left, but simply went underground, waiting in the soil. The legend held such power that it allegedly haunted the mind of William the Conqueror in 1066. The Norman Duke, a descendant of Vikings himself, Rollo, his ancestor, was a contemporary of this age, knew the stories of Ivar. Before he could feel secure in his conquest of England, William reportedly marched to the site of Ivar's mound. He ordered his soldiers to dig. Imagine the scene. Norman knights in chainmail, standing on a windswept English beach, digging into the earth not for gold, but for a skeleton. When they found the remains of the boneless commander, William did not treat them with the respect due a fellow warrior. He ordered the bones to be dug up and burned to ash on a pyre, scattering the dust into the wind. He had to physically and spiritually evict the ghost of Ivar before he could claim the crown. Only when the skeleton sentry was destroyed did William feel that the curse was lifted, allowing the Norman conquest to take root. Whether this event physically happened or is a literary invention of the 13th century to legitimize Norman rule, it underscores the titanic impact Ivar had on the psyche of Britain. He was not just a man. He was a geological force, a lingering trauma that required an exorcism 200 years after his death. Back in the 9th century, however, Ivar's death left a vacuum that the Great Heathen Army could not fill. The brain was gone. The brothers who remained, Ubbi, Halfdan, Guthrum, were formidable warriors, terrifying in their physical prowess, but they lacked the cold, multi-layered intellect of the boneless. They were hammers without a hand to guide them. The army began to lose its terrifying cohesion. Halfdan took a portion of the host north to fight the Picts and eventually settle in York, effectively retiring from the war against Wessex. Guthrum took the remainder and focused on the south, but he was prone to mistakes that Ivar would never have made. He was impulsive where Ivar was patient. He was greedy where Ivar was ambitious. The avalanche that had been a single, unstoppable block of ice began to break apart into smaller, manageable stones. This fragmentation was the miracle Alfred needed. The death of Ivar leveled the playing field. Alfred was no longer playing chess against a grandmaster. He was playing against a brawler. The fear that had paralyzed the Saxons began to lift, replaced by a grim determination. The boneless terror was dead. The god of war was just a pile of bones on a beach. The Saxons realized that if Ivar could die, then the Vikings could be beaten. The psychological spell was broken. The news of Ivar's death likely traveled to Alfred in his fortress at Winchester as a divine signal. The board was resetting. The winter of waiting was over. The year of battles was past. And now the final confrontation was approaching. Guthrum, the new leader of the southern Danes, was preparing a surprise attack, a move intended to catch Alfred off guard during the holy festivities of Twelfth Night. He wanted to be the new Ivar, the new master of traps. But he was fighting a different Alfred now. An Alfred who had built ships, an Alfred who had built forts, and an Alfred who knew that the monsters were mortal. The section closes with the image of the mound on the beach, the grass blowing in the wind, hiding the remains of the man who had reshaped the world. The waves crash against the shore, a rhythmic eternal sound that washes away the footprints of the mourners. Ivar is gone. The sentry is set. But inland, The fires are being lit. The final test of the Great Heathen Army is not a test of conquest, but of endurance. Can they hold what they have stolen without the genius who stole it for them? The ghost is watching, but the living have one last game to play. The final movement of the Great Heathen Army was not a march of conquest, but a settling of dust. It began, however, with one last desperate convulsion of violence. In January 878 AD, amidst the frozen silence of Twelfth Night, the very tail end of the Christmas feast, Guthrum made his move. He attacked Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham, under the cover of winter darkness, shattering the holy truce that the Saxons held dear. It was a maneuver worthy of Ivar the Boneless, a strike designed to decapitate the last remaining English resistance in a single night. Alfred barely escaped. The King of Wessex, the last hope of Anglo-Saxon Britain, was reduced to a fugitive, slipping into the dark waters of the Somerset marshes with a handful of loyal followers. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed that the avalanche had finally reached the sea. The entire island was effectively under Viking control. The piglets had won. The old boar's vengeance was absolute. But history is rarely a straight line. It is a pendulum. In the solitude of the marshes, hiding among the reeds and the biting damp of the Isle of Athelney, Alfred did not despair. He hardened. The pressure of the Great Heathen Army, which had crushed Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, compressed Wessex into a diamond. 7 weeks after Easter, Alfred rode out of the marshes. He did not come as a beggar, but as a resurrection. He summoned the levies of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to meet him at Egbert's Stone, a boundary marker of the old kings. The chronicle describes the scene with a touching simplicity. When the people saw him, they were fain of him. They were overcome with joy. The Great Heathen Army, camped at Edington, looked out to see a shield wall that they had thought destroyed reforming on the ridge. The Battle of Edington that followed was the final argument between the two worlds. It was not a battle of swift maneuvers or clever traps, but a grinding, brutal contest of will. The Saxon shield wall, tempered by the reforms of the peace years, held firm against the Viking charge. They pushed back. They ground the great host into the dirt. Guthrum, the heir to the invasion, was forced to retreat to his fortress, besieged, and eventually starved into submission. The surrender of Guthrum marked the end of the Great Heathen Army as a conquering force and the beginning of its life as a cultural ingredient. Alfred, in a moment of supreme statesmanship, did not execute Guthrum. He did not carve a blood eagle into his back. Instead, he stood godfather to him. In the Treaty of Wedmore, Guthrum was baptized as Athelstan, accepting the Christian God, and crucially, accepting a border. England was carved in two. To the south and west lay Alfred's Wessex, the land of English law. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, the land where Viking custom ruled. This was the landscape reshaped. The avalanche had stopped sliding and had become part of the mountain. The Vikings were told, "You may stay, but you must settle." And settle they did. The warriors who had crossed the sea to burn monasteries now hung up their swords and picked up plows. They took the land they had fought for and began to farm it. The floating city was dismantled, its timber used to build barns and fences. This is the true, lasting legacy of the Great Heathen Army. Not the kings they killed, but the neighbors they became. The two populations, Saxon and Dane, began to bleed into one another. It was a slow, quiet fusion that happened in the market squares, in the marriage beds, and across the fence lines of farms. The hatred of the invasion slowly dissolved into the pragmatism of daily life. We see this hybridization most clearly in the map of England today. Look at the names of the towns, places ending in by, like Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, or Thorpe, like Scunthorpe, are Viking echoes, the Old Norse words for farm or village, stamped permanently onto the English countryside. The very language you speak, the language I am whispering to you now, is a child of this collision. Before the Vikings, the English language was different. The Vikings gave us the harsh, hard sounds of the north. They gave us the words for the most basic elemental things: sky, egg, skin, leg, window, wind-eye, knife, dirt, bag. Even the pronouns they, them, and their are Norse gifts. The Great Heathen Army forced the English language to simplify, to shed its complex endings so that two peoples could trade and talk. They didn't just break the kingdoms, they rebuilt the tongue. Historians still argue whether the Viking invasion was a disaster that set England back or the necessary fire that forged a nation. Without the Great Heathen Army, there would have been no England. There would have been only the squabbling separate kingdoms of Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia. The Vikings destroyed the old order. They wiped the slate clean. By shattering the other kingdoms, they left Wessex as the sole survivor, the only seed from which a united England could grow. Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, would eventually conquer the Danelaw and become the first true king of England. But he could only do so because the Vikings had already done the heavy lifting of dismantling the old heptarchy. The sons of Ragnar, in their quest for vengeance, had inadvertently acted as the grim midwives of a new nation. As we stand at the end of this century of blood, looking back from the year 900 AD, the smoke has cleared. The dragon ships are rotting on the beaches or have been repurposed for trade. The snake pit, where Ragnar died, is overgrown with grass, a forgotten hollow in the ground. The ridge where Isla suffered the blood eagle is just a hill where sheep graze, indifferent to the ghosts of kings. The hedgehog martyr Edmund is sleeping in his shrine, surrounded by pilgrims. The boneless Ivar is dust on the coast, his curse fading with the tides. The Great Heathen Army has vanished, not because it was destroyed, but because it was absorbed. It is in the DNA of the people of Yorkshire and East Anglia. It is in the dialect of the North. It is in the blue eyes and the height of the locals. The piglets did not just grunt. They rooted themselves in the soil so deeply that they could never be pulled out. The story of the Great Heathen Army is a paradox. It is a story of extreme violence that ended in creation. It is a story of a foreign infection that strengthened the host. As the camera pulls back for the final time, drifting high above the British Isles, we no longer see a land divided by war. We see a patchwork quilt of green and gold, stitched together with the grey thread of Roman roads and the blue thread of rivers. We see a land that is no longer Saxon, no longer Viking, but something new, something stronger. The night has passed. The storm has blown itself out. The avalanche has settled, and on the new slopes it created, fresh grass is beginning to grow. The history is done. The silence that follows is the peace of a world that has survived its own end and found a way to begin again. The fires in the longhouses have burned down to soft, glowing embers, casting a faint, warm light on the timber walls. The shouting of the battlefield has faded into the rhythmic hush of the sea rolling against the shore, a sound that has not changed in 1,000 years. The kings and the conquerors have laid down their heads, their angers and their ambitions smoothed away by the gentle erosion of time. History, with all its sharp edges and sudden turns, has finally come to rest. It is no longer a burden to be carried, but a story to be folded away like a heavy winter cloak that is no longer needed. Let the image of the dragon ships dissolve into the mist. Let the map of England blur into a soft, green haze. You are safe here, far from the cold winds of the North Sea, far from the reach of the years. The past is a quiet ghost that walks behind you, not to haunt, but to remind you that everything passes, everything settles, and peace always returns in the end. The darkness around you is not the darkness of the grave or the dungeon, but the velvet darkness of sleep, heavy and kind. Breathe it in. Let the silence wrap around you like the fur on a king's bench. The story is over. The world is still. Sweet dreams.